Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Think of this as your professional university lecture covering section 23.4 of our software engineering textbook. Today, we're focusing on an absolutely vital concept in modern software development, Agile Planning. Now, if you recall our previous discussions on traditional software processes, you know that rigid planning can sometimes lead to, well, really expensive rework when requirements inevitably change. Agile planning is the antidote to that. It's essential for coping with changing environments, and getting a solid grip on this framework is critical for your success, not just in your upcoming exams, but for sure in your future careers as software engineers. So, get your notebooks ready and let's jump in. Here is our roadmap for today. We're starting with an introduction to Agile Planning. Then we'll unpack the mechanics of the Agile Planning game. From there, we'll look at story points and velocity, the 3 levels of planning, the golden rule, and finally, a summary and exam recap.
Section 1. Introduction to Agile Planning. Let's dive right into this paradigm shift and contrast the rigid, old-school development methods with the modern Agile mindset.
To truly grasp Agile Planning, we really have to compare it to the plan-driven approach we studied in previous sections. In a traditional plan-driven process, the project manager attempts to lock in all the features up front. You literally specify exactly what the software will do, and then you just sort of guess the timeline required to build it. The problem with that? Well, environments change, and guessing the timeline almost always leads to late deliveries. Agile planning flips this completely upside down. In Agile, you lock in the timeline. The delivery dates are fixed, set in stone. What remains flexible are the features themselves. The decision on what functionality to actually include in a system increment is decided during development, which lets you adapt directly to the customer's changing priorities. So if you remember just one thing from this comparison, Agile prioritizes timeline certainty over rigid feature lists.
Section 2. The Agile Planning Game. Now, what's really fascinating is how extreme programming actually structures this flexibility in practice. Let's meticulously walk through this workflow, which represents figure 23.8 in your textbook. The planning game starts with step 1, story identification. This is where the customer works with the development team to write user stories, basically short everyday scenarios describing the functionality they want. Step 2 is initial estimation, where the team ranks these stories based on how long they think they'll take to implement. Step 3 is release planning, where you're looking months ahead to decide which stories go into the next major version of the software. Then step 4 is iteration planning, shrinking the focus to the next 2 to 4 weeks to pick stories for the current development cycle. And finally, step 5 is task planning, where those broad user stories are broken down into specific technical tasks for the developers. In essence, the planning game is this very logical top-down flow, starting from broad customer stories and filtering straight down to individual programming tasks.
Section 3. Story points and velocity. Let's look at how we actually measure the effort required for these stories, because this is a crucial concept you absolutely must recognize for your exams.
Okay, we need to address a really common misconception here. When estimating tasks, beginners almost always try to guess absolute hours. They'll say a feature will take exactly 14 hours to code. But human psychology shows us that we're actually terrible at absolute estimation. We get it wrong all the time. However, humans are incredibly good at relative comparison. So instead of guessing hours, Agile teams use relative estimation. We don't say how many hours a feature takes. We simply look at 2 features and say, you know, this one looks about twice as hard as that one.
And that brings us to the definition of story points. Story points are a relative ranking system. You assign a notional effort to user stories by comparing them to one another. For example, if a simple login screen is assigned a value of, say, 2 points, and a complex payment gateway feels roughly 4 times as difficult to build, well, you assign the payment gateway 8 points. It's a brilliant way to quantify effort without getting bogged down in wildly inaccurate hourly guesses.
But you might be wondering, how do we actually translate those arbitrary points into a schedule? Enter velocity. Velocity is defined as the number of effort points a development team can complete per day, or per iteration. So if your team historically completes 30 story points in a 2-week cycle, your velocity is 30. It's your capacity bucket. You use this crucial metric to calculate exactly how much work fits into the next cycle. You just select stories from the top of the customer's priority list until the points add up to 30. Ultimately, you're estimating relative effort using story points and measuring actual capacity using velocity.
Section 4. 3 levels of planning. This next part brilliantly illustrates how Agile teams manage their time across 3 very different horizons. Let's break down these 3 tiers side by side. Make sure to memorize these distinct timeframes and their exact purposes for your upcoming tests. At the top level, we have release planning. This looks several months ahead to decide which stories actually make it into the next major software release. The middle level, iteration planning, shrinks our horizon down to just 2 to 4 weeks, picking specific stories for the current sprint based entirely on the team's velocity. Finally, task planning happens right at ground level, dealing with a 4 to 16-hour window where we break those accepted stories down into highly specific developer tasks. Now I want to highlight a massive difference in human behavior here regarding that bottom level of task planning. In traditional plan-driven projects, managers assign tasks to developers, right? But in Agile, developers look at the list of tasks and they sign up for them. Managers do not assign them. This creates deep psychological ownership. When a developer actively chooses their own task, it significantly boosts their motivation to get it done. So as you can see, planning in Agile filters all the way down from months-long releases to daily tasks. But at the end of the day, it's entirely driven by developer ownership.
Section 5, the Golden Rule. So the absolute crucial point we have to address now is how an Agile team handles adversity when time inevitably runs short.
Let me pose this scenario directly to you. Imagine you're halfway through a 2-week iteration. You check your velocity and you realize, the team has only completed a quarter of the work. You are falling way behind. What do you do? Take a second to really think about it. Do you go to the customer and ask for a deadline extension?
The answer is absolutely not. No way. You follow the golden rule of Agile planning. The delivery date is sacred. You never extend the deadline. Extending deadlines just causes this massive domino effect that disrupts the entire release schedule. Instead, you talk to the customer, you drop a story, and you reduce the scope. You minimize the feature set to ensure you still deliver a working piece of software on the agreed-upon date. So burn this into your memory. If progress lags halfway through, you absolutely must minimize the scope, never the timeline.
Section 6, Summary and Exam Recap. Let's wrap up this explainer by consolidating the most critical facts and the downsides that you need to review before your exam.
First, let's ground ourselves in reality here. Agile planning is an incredible tool, but it's not perfect for every single program. It has very clear downsides. Number 1, it requires constant customer availability to write those user stories and negotiate scope. And in the real world, customers are busy, making this level of access pretty rare. Number 2, the informal communication of Agile completely breaks down for massive, geographically distributed teams who really need rigorous documentation to stay aligned. And number 3, while dropping stories protects your schedule, it can seriously disrupt customer plans if they were relying on that specific feature for their day-to-day business operations.
All right, here's your final checklist of key facts that are highly likely to appear on your exam papers. Ensure you fully understand the core difference between a locked Agile timeline and flexible features. Know all 5 steps of the planning game by heart. Be able to explain exactly why we use relative story points instead of absolute hours. Understand how to use velocity to calculate what fits into an iteration. And finally, remember the human element. Psychological ownership is created when developers sign up for their own tasks rather than being assigned them.
Before we go, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. We just learned that Agile is brilliant for small, nimble teams but struggles at scale. So, if Agile breaks down for massive, distributed teams, how do we successfully engineer software on a global scale? Think about how you might combine the sheer flexibility of Agile with the necessary structure of plan-driven methods. This question perfectly transitions into our next topic of the software engineering course, where we'll be exploring scaling Agile methods and distributed software engineering. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Study hard, and I will see you in the next lecture.